This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. It may well be over 50 years old, but it is still the most popular programme on Radio 4, and no programme attracts more correspondence from feedback listeners. It is, of course, the Today programme, and this week its editor Jamie Angus came into our studio to answer criticism about lack of news, lack of balance and rude presenters. And, of course, if you can't listen to feedback live, you can always use the new BBC iPlayer radio app. Well, you can try to, but be warned, it has driven some would-be users round the bend.
If I had foisted this sort of interface on most of my clients, they wouldn't pay my bill at the end of the project.
And we also visit the longest-running non-news programme in Britain, and perhaps in the world. It's the Daily Service, and you may be surprised to hear how it started.
It was probably one of the very early examples of listener feedback bringing about change in the BBC.
Let's see if you can bring about more change. We begin with the very public trial of the South African athlete Oscar Pistorius, charged with the murder of his girlfriend. It still continues, as do your emails about the BBC radio coverage. Last week, all of those who contacted us felt there was far too much reporting of the trial, and that a lot of it was too emotional. BBC News justified its coverage by telling us that the story was among the most read stories on the BBC News website, which shows considerable audience interest in the trial. For Andrew from Kent, this was a less than impressive response.
Your BBC wonk came on and did the usual spiel. Everybody else is wrong. Blah-de-blah, go away, we will do it any way we like. I mean, the arrogance of this is quite mind-bending.
And there are others who agree with Andrew. But this week, we've heard from listeners who think the BBC is right to give the story plenty of airtime.
My name is Moira Atherton, and I live in Cardiff in South Wales. I think it's good to broadcast it for people. I mean, the whole case illustrates patriarchy in South Africa to a certain extent, and I thought the coverage was very good.
I'm prompted to submit this by the 100% feedback response against the BBC coverage of the Pistorius trial. I'm interested in the reports, and I'm glad they're being reported in detail. In most countries, it's not possible to report trials like this, so well done, BBC, for doing so from South Africa.
Well, Jamie Angus, the editor of the Today programme, is right here. We'll be talking to him in detail about Today in just a moment. But, Jamie, first, ask you about Pistorius' trial. Is it irresistible when you have everything in the court being covered, when you have a murder, where you have two extremely attractive people, and can you not avoid doing that story?
Well, I think you're right to say that the availability of the material from the court has driven quite a lot of the coverage. It's very unusual to be able to carry live proceedings through inside a court like that. Interestingly, Today hasn't actually covered the Pistorius trial very much. It doesn't generally fall in our time. But I think it's worth saying that we know that audiences are extremely engaged with this story. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to shape the coverage accordingly.
Well, while the Oscar Pistorius trial has been a frequent concern of feedback listeners over the last few weeks, even without it, the Today programme can be relied upon to fill our inbox. Judged by its increasing audience and the frequency with which it makes news as well as reports it, the programme is a success. It is much loved, but it is also much complained about. We've been asking our listeners for questions and comments on Today, and there have been some recurring critical themes.
My name is Rick Sheldon. I'm from London, Kensington, and I was listening to the Today programme, as is usual, and listening yet again to what appeared to me a trivial item, Britpop.
Britpop is our subject. Looking back on 20 years of it, we're with Steve Lamacq, DJ on...
Very strange, seeing as Today is supposed to be a serious programme.
My name is Diane McRae, and I live in Lower Weedon, Northamptonshire. So it was an interview with Naomi Oni. Naomi had been the victim of an acid attack. The fact that she was in such a lot of pain came across quite quickly. The interview seemed to be very, very long and going over the same ground. I thought at that time of the morning and the amount of news that was more current, perhaps, that this particular item took up too much time, although I have a great deal of sympathy for the young woman concerned.
My name's Jill, and I live in Guildford. I was horrified when I heard the interview by Evan Davis. He was interviewing Ian Duncan Smith. I don't think I've ever heard quite such an appalling interview.
Trying to understand.
Well, let me give you an example.
Well, let me take my example. Let me ask you.
Evan Davis couldn't stop talking, couldn't stop questioning. He said, "Let me put my question." Well, it is impossible for the listener to hear what anybody is saying when they are talking through each other.
Well, Jamie Angus, let's start with that interview with Ian Duncan Smith. It was a painful listen in parts, wasn't it?
In parts, I think it was difficult. I think one of the things that
it was impossible to listen, actually. It was impossible to understand because both people were talking over each other.
As your listener said, in parts, there were 2 extended periods of interrupting. And Evan and I, when we had a chat about it afterwards, Evan said the bits of the interview where people weren't talking over each other were very satisfactory.
But did you say to him, or the bits where they were talking over each other was a mistake?
Look, one of the things people need to understand about this interview was that ideally we have sort of people face-to-face in the studio, and one of the difficulties about this particular one was that they were down the line, as we say, on the programme, so it was very difficult for them to pick up on each other's verbal cues about when, in natural conversation, you might pause when you see somebody's trying to cut in. But I think Evan and I agree that actually the extended periods of interrupting didn't particularly work well in that interview. But look, this is always a judgment call with big political interviews because politicians come on, they have a perfectly legitimate right to try and get often quite complex ideas across, but there always has to be give and take and an interplay between how long answers go on and when they're cut off. And for the majority of that interview, Ian Duncan Smith had a long time to make some well-extended answers, and overall I didn't see there was a huge problem with it.
Do you routinely debrief presenters? And have you ever told John Humphreys that one of his interviews left something to be desired? Would you dare?
I mean, look, yes, of course we talk about interviews all the time, and of course we have to sit down afterwards and talk about what went well and went badly, and you bet we do it every day.
Let me read you an email from Nicholas Barnard. The bane of the BBC listener's life is the rudeness of its presenters and their slavishness to the clock. The Today programme is worse. I find all the "have to stop you there" and "forgive me for interrupting" makes it unlistenable, which is a shame. How do you decide how long to give an interview? And do you think, on the whole, looking back, maybe you've given some political interviews too little time?
That's certainly true. I wouldn't pretend that we get this right every morning. Look, there is a sort of tyranny of the clock, which is that once an hour we have to get to the pips at the top of the hour. And most crucially, we have to get to the weather forecast. That means we have to be pretty disciplined sometimes about coming out of interviews. But I don't pretend that we get the considerations right all the time. We try and be flexible when we're in the most sensitive interviews, and I think the most troubling thing is when you're in a position where you've got to come out of an interview that is very sort of sensitive or personal or difficult, and we try to avoid doing that. But of course we sometimes end up cutting people off, and I know that people don't like that.
Well, sometimes you cut in the view of our listeners, you cut the weather off. Kathy Williams says, the weather is so fast sometimes, it's impossible to follow. Please give it a decent amount of time for a proper forecast.
Nobody takes the weather more seriously than me or the presenters, and we know how much importance people attach to it. And I think particularly there's an issue, I was thinking about this over the floods and some of the difficult weather conditions in the winter. There's many mornings when actually giving a really proper detailed readout of the weather is one of the most important things on the programme, and we do everything we can to avoid doing that. So I'm sorry, in some circumstances it can get occasionally squeezed.
Can I ask you about your arts coverage? You heard one of our listeners talk about Britpop, which they didn't think much of. But others have raised the question that today is becoming perhaps less analytical, more celebratory, softer in other words. Here's Ian Shirley from Perth in Scotland.
More and more of the Today programme gets involved in what I would call front row material, whether it's modern art and the like. It's not news per se. Somewhere in that Today programme there is an editorial bent to take us away from the hard issues and get to the soft issues.
Jamie Angus, is that true?
I think anyone listening with a fair and open mind across 3 hours of the programme, let alone across a whole week of output, would be in no doubt as to what the programme's core proposition is. It is a serious news programme at its heart. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we don't cover a wide range of editorial topics, including art stories. And actually, if you tried to argue the opposite, that Today shouldn't cover major national art stories, I think that would be a very, very difficult position to argue.
Well, one of our listeners does think you're spending a little more time on human interest stories. One of the concerns was about an interview with a woman who had suffered an acid attack. It was a 12-minute item. The interview was carried out by Michelle Hussein, and I think the concern of some listeners that the interview went on from 8:10 to 22 minutes past 8, the prime, if you like, interview slot in your programme. Why did you decide to give it so much time?
I think you have to make a judgment on every day about what the material you have available. And in the case of the Naomi Oni interview, I think we felt there had been a great deal of interest in the case. And we felt that it was a powerful personal interview. And I think that some of the kind of pejorative labels used to describe these types of interviews, so people sometimes email in saying that they're daytime TV or that they're Jeremy Kyle interviews, I think that's unfair. I thought Michelle did a sensitive interview on a difficult topic. It was a long interview, but I felt in the end that it would be insensitive to have cut it much down from what it was.
Well, we're coming to the end of our interview, and I want to raise this question of balance, specifically in relation to climate change. The programme has come in from some criticism, particularly of a story in which Today interviewed Nigel Lawson, who's a former MP, former Chancellor, of course, but a non-scientist who's sceptical about climate change, alongside a climate change expert and scientist. And this is from Liz from Lewis, who is very concerned about the presence of Nigel Lawson on Today.
I was seriously disturbed by the interview. It seems to me an extraordinary idea of balance that's involved here, to say that when you have a whole group of people, all experts in their field, who say one thing, balance means finding somebody with no expertise in that area to say the opposite.
So, Jamie Angus, in this case about the fact, if you like, of climate change, do you need to balance your discussions?
The BBC's reviewed its coverage of climate change and climate science, and it's set out some admirably clear guidelines for us to follow. We are able to put on air people who take a differing view from the majority view of climate science. However, that coverage should be proportional, and I think that any reasonable listener who listened to today's coverage of climate change across the past 3 months would probably find that Lord Lawson was the only climate sceptic, if you like, who'd appeared in that period. And I think, when Justin and I and the programme team had discussed that interview, we thought we'd allowed it to drift too much into a straight yes-no argument about the science. And, of course, the settled view of the expert scientists is just that, settled. And I believe that our coverage reflects that over the long term.
Well, finally, when you went for the job, what was your pitch? What was the vision?
Well, it's funny because I first worked on Today in January 1999, and I was thinking this morning that my first memory of the programme was probably hearing it as a child in about 1980. And it's a job I'd always wanted to do. It's also a really important part of everyone's life, and you always have to be thinking about that. So in as much as we're changing things on the programme, I'm trying to think about how important it is to do breaking news better, so people need to know what's happened since they went to sleep. But they also have to have a feel that the sort of tenor and tone of the programme is calm and consistent, so there was no major surgery required. And so much of the job is about just getting individual decisions right on the day, and also making sure that the really big things about the programme, its presenters, its presentation, are right, and that the sound of the programme is right and the audience are happy with it.
And have you got the programme, if you like, where you want it?
I think that some of the changes that have been made on the programme, to have Michelle start presenting the programme last year, for example, is something that I really wanted to happen. And I'm delighted that the programme's pretty much got record audiences, and I'm just dedicated to keeping it working in the way that it's working at the moment.
Our thanks to Jamie Angus, the man who never sleeps, and of course to you for your views. You can write to Feedback, PO Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can send an email to feedback@bbc.co.uk. And you can tweet us at BBCR4Feedback. All those details are on our website. Now, for many of you, today, like other popular radio programmes, is something you listen to in the home, in the car, or more recently, just about anywhere in the world. That's been possible thanks to the BBC iPlayer app, which gives you radio on tablets and mobile phones. Well, I said possible. Should I say increasingly impossible? You've been getting in touch to report a recent change to the way it looks and works, which seems to have made it unusable.
I'm Kevin Rogers. I'm from Pembrokeshire, South West Wales. I use the iPlayer app for listening to radio on a regular basis, and the recent changes simply makes it much more difficult to find content. It certainly looks younger and more whizzy, but in terms of access to radio programs, it's a backward step.
My name's Tanya Galliara, and I'm from London. Recently, There was an update to the app. The original app was great because it was very easy to search for programs and to go back past a couple of days. And it was very sort of easy to use, user-friendly. The radio app, it's very much more difficult to use. It's very difficult to go back and search for programs. It's very frustrating.
My name is James Curtis and I live in Rutland. There used to be a wonderful app for the BBC iPlayer, and just over a week ago, that app was suddenly replaced, certainly for radio, by a new piece of software which just quite frankly doesn't work. So going on to Play Store, which is where you have to download this app from, there are hundreds and hundreds of threads from people similarly affected, people who used to use the radio iPlayer, who can now no longer use it.
So we decided to do some catching up of our own. Andrew Scott is General Manager of Radio BBC Future Media, and I met him along with listener Nick Gilbody, a formerly loyal fan of the app. Well, Andrew, you started the process of introducing this new iPlayer app about 18 months ago, but there's been an acceleration in the last couple of weeks of concerns and complaints about it. What changes have you made 2 or 3 weeks ago that will have caused this?
What we've done with the two applications now is put them both into a focused mode. So the iPlayer TV application focuses on TV, and the iPlayer radio application focuses on radio. And with the iPlayer radio application, we're trying to satisfy a variety of user needs, the first of which is listening to the radio, typically live, but also on demand. But also what we find is that the application is used a lot for people who are either planning their listening or who are listening to an FM or a DAB radio as well. And so it's a companion to that listening.
Well, the crucial question is, of course, access. And, Nick, you found that rather difficult. What's been the problem?
It was incredibly difficult to get to the places that I wanted to be using the Radio Player app.
Now, you've got a tablet in front of you.
Yeah.
Could you take us through the process and show us where you got stuck?
OK. I'm looking at the content, and because of the way it's designed, anything that's got a busy bit of radio, the gap for the words is not big enough. The Today programme on the schedule is fine because it's one word and it's 3 hours of programming or 2 hours. But if you look at that, there's book or. Now, as a Radio 4 listener, I know that's going to be Book of the Week, but only because I'm a Radio 4 listener.
Yes. So the amount of information on the screen to tell you what the programmes are is very limited and requires you to know the schedule well before you can use it.
That view is designed to give users a very clear timeline across the different channels.
Yep.
And in order to keep the integrity of the timeline, we ended up having to shorten some of the programs. That wouldn't be the only view, though, and it's probably worth looking at some of the other ones.
There are other views, but none that do all the stations at the same time.
All the stations at the same time. Yeah. That's right. One of the key things to say here is that absolutely we're taking feedback, and we get about 300 comments a week. We take all of those, we read all of those. We don't always reply to all of them, but we certainly look at the issues. In fact, we just solved a problem yesterday from one of your listeners who'd phoned in about a search problem, and we took a look at it, solved it. It'll be going live in the next week or so.
So, Nick, you've got concerns about the way in which the information is presented. How about actually getting through to the programmes you want to listen to?
The problem is the quality of the playback. The minute the radio app came out, the playback started stuttering, it became halting, there was gaps. And this was sitting at home next to a Wi-Fi router.
Andrew Scott?
Yeah, I'm obviously very sorry that you're having a disappointing experience on that, because certainly the point of a radio app is to be able to listen to the radio, whether live or catch-up. So we've had a small number of pieces of feedback that say that listening quality has been a problem. We're actually in the process of replacing all of the technology that does the encoding, but the difference between the old iPlayer app, where the TV and radio were combined, and the iPlayer radio app shouldn't be that great.
The other problem I've got is the way that I navigate, or that I used to navigate, was by using what they call genre. And I used to particularly listen to comedy programmes. If I go to comedy now, and I go to satire, for instance, as the subgenre, there is only one programme in that subgenre, which is the news quiz, which I don't think that matches the reality of what's being broadcast.
OK, if there's a problem with that, again, I'd like to take a look at that. Clearly our intention is to make all of the content available. That's why we're here. If there's a difference in the way that we're presenting that online on the PCs versus the mobiles, that's a bug, that's not a feature.
It seems to be something that does need some work, because of the first three categories within comedy, they're all empty.
I think there's a really good user experience point here, which is at the moment we display the list of all of the categories that exist, whether or not there's anything in them.
Yeah.
That's probably not very good. So that's definitely something that we've taken away and are looking at. And there's some design work going on at the moment to try and address that.
Nick, there are teething troubles, but do you think there is a promised land to get to? I mean, can you see that when eventually these things are sorted out, it will be an improved service, or are you still sceptical?
The previous version did what I needed it to do. I don't see the need to improve, and numerous comments that I've seen on the message boards just ask the question, why fix it if it's not broken?
Sandra, if people do want to get in contact, and a lot of them have had difficulty in doing so, what's the best way of getting their point across to you?
There's an email address and there's a Twitter handle. We will make these available on your website so that you've got a reference for these and so people can find it on the feedback side.
Listener Nick Gilbody and the BBC's General Manager of Radio, BBC Future Media, Andrew Scott. Now, what do we have in common with those listening to an embryonic BBC back in the 1920s? The answer is this. The Daily Service Singers, from Wednesday's edition of the Venerable Christian Worship Programme, which is broadcast each morning on Radio 4 on longwave and DAB. Easter, of course, is a special time for Christians, and that is reflected in programmes across the BBC networks. But the Daily Service is a staple of radio worship all year, and has been since 1928. But without the efforts of just one listener, the Daily Service might never have existed. Armed with present-day listener questions, feedback reporter Catherine Godfrey went along to Emmanuel Church in Didsbury, on the outskirts of Manchester, to meet the Daily Service team, and she arrived as the singers were rehearsing for that morning's broadcast.
Big crescendo, big one, and...
It's just after 9:30 and the singers have finished their run-through for the programme, making sure it's fine for time, that they don't crash the pips at 10 o'clock. And I'm joined here by soprano singer Sasha Johnson-Manning and by the musical director here for the Daily Service, which is Richard Tanner. Sasha, first of all, is it strange not having an audience, not having a live congregation here?
Well, you do. We all think about the people that are listening. I always feel the people listening are part of it as much as we are. So.
And Richard, what kind of music are you choosing this week? It's obviously a very special week in the Christian calendar.
Yes, well, it's music for sort of Passion Tides and Holy Week. Yesterday we did an excerpt from Stainer's Crucifixion, which was absolutely lovely to do. And today we're doing a Bob Chilcott arrangement of a spiritual, Were You There When They Crucified My Lord? And of course some very well-known Holy Week hymns like There Is a Green Hill Far Away.
I'm Philip Bilson. I'm the series producer for the worship output on BBC Network Radio.
Philip, the Daily Service, it's been going since 1928. And am I right in saying that it was the result of a very persistent listener?
Yep, it was probably one of the very early examples of listener feedback bringing about change in the BBC. Because in 1926, a lady called Kathleen Cordeau wrote into the Director General and said, we need a daily act of worship to help listeners who are not able to get to church and who would really appreciate just a moment of meditation and Christian worship in their lives daily.
It's now just before 9:45. The choir have taken their places. I'm stepping into the back to listen to the broadcast as we go.
The Daily Service is led by John Forrest.
Good morning. The graphic events we remember in Holy Week. We are in a real church here, and there's a worshipping congregation that comes here weekly, and so there is a feel of this being a place of worship. When you're in a radio studio, the acoustic is different to begin with. Everything is dead, and you can form a sort of intimate relationship with the listener, and that's good. When you're in a church, you're declaiming a little more, aren't you? You're speaking in a way where you've got an audience that's listening to you that you can see. Let's remember and lift to God the rescue operation following the ferry disaster in South Korea, which had so many young people as passengers. Before I come in, I'm listening to what's going on to see if there's something that we need to connect with today. And yes, the ferry disaster is something that I know that I feel deeply for, and obviously listeners will as well. So that's a very appropriate thing to pray about and to invite people to join in with that prayer. Also, let's bring before God the tense and volatile circumstances in the Ukraine this morning. remembering the attention.
Philip, you do have a great many listeners who do appreciate what you do with the daily service. Some of those have written to us with questions for you. So Leo Placid wants to know which version of the Bible is used for the readings on the daily service.
Really, it's a matter of the version that the particular person wants to use. So if we have a Catholic presenter, it'll be the Jerusalem Bible, probably. It really is a question of what works best in that particular programme. The presenter's given a text, a theme, 3 pieces of music. Then it's up to them to weave out of that a coherent presentation which takes the listener on a spiritual journey.
One thing we often hear from listeners about the daily service is the confusion that ensues at 9:45. How can they find you on DAB?
About a minute before the service begins, and then throughout the service, it's available as a channel next to the Radio 4 station. And you simply select the daily service on the tuning wheel or the tuning implement, and it'll actually come up.
Hopefully we've resolved that. And it is always there on Trusty Longwave as well. We are now a far more secular nation. Although Christianity is the dominant religion still, it has reduced substantially. Do things like the daily service still have a relevance in that context?
Well, I certainly believe they do, and the audience feedback indicates very clearly that the daily service still matters to people. I mean, last weekend, Sunday worship was the top appreciation on the listener log. And that isn't that infrequent. And from the feedback we get with the daily service, we know it's very important to people.
So may we go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. I'm very conscious that listening to the daily service will be people who really value Christian worship, and it may be something that's a bit of a lifeline to them. I'm also conscious of what I like to think of as, in old-fashioned terms, as a sort of commercial traveller, someone who's driving, who maybe is facing the stress and tensions of life, perhaps by chance stumbles on the daily service, and there we are talking about something that's more eternal, that's got something more abiding than just the stresses of today's life.
Catherine Godfrey talking to Philip Bilson, presenter John Forrest and the Daily Service Singers. And in the next series of feedback, we're planning to take a detailed look at religious and ethical broadcasting on BBC Radio, so please do send us your thoughts on everything from Sunday and the Sunday service to Thought for the Day and Beyond Belief. Next week is the last programme in this series of feedback, and we have a treat for Archers fans, as we're joined by Sean O'Connor, the drama's editor. Goodbye. Charged with the murder of his girlfriend. It still continues, as do your emails about the BBC Radio coverage. Last week, all of those who contacted us felt there was far too much reporting of the trial, and that a lot of it was too emotional. BBC News justified its coverage by telling us that the story was among the most read stories on the BBC News website, which shows considerable audience interest in the trial. For Andrew from Kent, this was a less than impressive response.
Your BBC wonk came on and did the usual spiel. Everybody else is wrong. Blah-de-blah.
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. It may well be over 50 years old, but it is still the most popular programme on Radio 4, and no programme attracts more correspondence from feedback listeners. It is, of course, the Today programme, and this week its editor Jamie Angus came into our studio to answer criticism about lack of news, lack of balance and rude presenters. And, of course, if you can't listen to feedback live, you can always use the new BBC iPlayer radio app. Well, you can try to, but be warned, it has driven some would-be users round the bend.
If I had foisted this sort of interface on most of my clients, they wouldn't pay my bill at the end of the project.
And we also visit the longest-running non-news programme in Britain, and perhaps in the world. It's the Daily Service, and you may be surprised to hear how it started.
It was probably one of the very early examples of listener feedback bringing about change in the BBC.
Let's see if you can bring about more change. We begin with the very public trial of the South African athlete Oscar Pistorius.
And I'm glad they're being reported in detail. In most countries, it's not possible to report trials like this, so well done, BBC, for doing so from South Africa.
Well, Jamie Angus, the editor of the Today programme, is right here. We'll be talking to him in detail about Today in just a moment. But, Jamie, first, ask you about Pistorius' trial. Is it irresistible when you have everything in the court being covered, when you have a murder, where you have two extremely attractive people, and can you not avoid doing that story?
Well, I think you're right to say that the availability of the material from the court has driven quite a lot of the coverage. It's very unusual to be able to carry live proceedings.
I'll go away, we will do it any way we like. I mean, the arrogance of this is quite mind-bending.
And there are others who agree with Andrew. But this week, we've heard from listeners who think the BBC is right to give the story plenty of airtime.
My name is Moira Atherton, and I live in Cardiff in South Wales. I think it's good to broadcast it for people. I mean, the whole case illustrates patriarchy in South Africa to a certain extent, and I thought the coverage was very good.
I'm prompted to submit this by the 100% feedback response against the BBC coverage of the Pistorius trial. I'm interested in the report.